Hello there, my name's Libby and I'd like to share with you one of my favourite stories. It's written by a man called Hans Christian Andersen. He was born 215 years ago in a country called Denmark. He lived until he was 70 years old, and during that time he wrote many stories, many of which became plays or ballets as well. Some of his stories you may have heard of, for example, The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, or The Emperor's New Clothes. Well, even though he lived such a long time ago, his stories are still very popular with children and adults alike. The Little Match Girl. It was New Year's Eve and dreadfully cold. The snow fell quickly in the darkening light as evening came on. In the cold and the darkness, there walked along the street a poor little girl. She wore no hat and no shoes. It's true that when she left home, she was wearing slippers, but they were much too big for her feet. They were her mother's slippers. But the little girl had lost them while running across the street, dodging 2 horse-drawn carriages that had almost run her down. When she'd looked for the slippers, only one was to be found. The other one had been grabbed by a boy, and he ran away with it. So on the little girl went, with her bare feet that were red and blue from the cold. In an old apron that she wore, she had bundles of matches, and she also carried a bundle in her hand. No one had bought a single match all day long. No one had given her even 1 penny. Poor little girl. Shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along feeling miserable. The snowflakes fell on her long hair, which hung in pretty curls around her neck. But she did not think of her beauty or of the cold. Lights shone from every window, and she could smell the beautiful smell of roast goose being cooked for New Year's Eve in all of the houses. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She was hungry. In a corner between 2 houses, she sat down. She tucked her little feet in underneath herself. But she grew colder and colder. She did not dare to go home because she had not sold any matches and could not bring any money. Her father would certainly not be pleased. Besides, it was cold enough at home, as they had only a roof above them that was full of holes. Now her little hands were nearly frozen with cold. She thought that maybe a match might warm her fingers if she lit it. She drew one out of the bundle and struck it. Ooh, how it blazed, how it burned! It gave out a warm, bright flame, like a little candle. She held her hands over it. Oh, what a wonderful little light it was. The little girl could imagine that she was in a beautiful room, standing in front of a great iron stove with a lovely fire burning inside it. So nicely it burned that the little girl stretched out her feet to warm them. How comfortable she was. But then the flame went out, the stove vanished, and nothing remained but the little burned match in her hand. She quickly struck another match against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light from it fell on the wall, she could suddenly see right through into the room again. A cloth as white as snow was spread upon the table. on which were laid beautiful china plates, while a stuffed roast goose cooked away, making a most delicious smell. And what was more delightful and curious and wonderful was that the goose jumped from the dish with the knife and fork still in its breast and waddled along the floor straight towards the little girl. But again the match went out and nothing was left but the thick, damp wall. She lit another match. Now she was under a most beautiful Christmas tree, larger and far more prettily decorated than any she had ever seen. Hundreds of candles were burning on the green branches, and little painted figures, like she had seen in shop windows, looked down on her. The child stretched out her hands to them, but the match went out. Still, though, the lights of the Christmas tree burned higher and higher into the sky, until she saw one fall, forming a long trail of fire. "Now someone is dying," murmured the child softly. She knew this because her grandmother, the person who had loved her the most in the world, and who was sadly now dead, had told her that whenever a star falls, a soul goes up to heaven. She struck yet another match against the wall. It lit, and in its brightness her dear old grandmother appeared before her, beaming with love and kindness. "Oh, grandmother," she said, "take me with you. I know you will go away when the match burns out. You too will vanish, like the warm stove, the splendid New Year's feast, the beautiful Christmas tree." And to make sure her grandmother would not disappear, she lit a whole bundle of matches against the wall. And they burned with such a brilliant light that it became brighter than the midday sun. Her grandmother had never looked so grand, so beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and they flew joyfully together, climbing higher and higher, far above the earth, away from cold and hunger. The next morning the little girl was found, leaning against the wall with red cheeks and a smiling mouth, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. She'd wanted to warm herself, the poor little thing, people said. "I wonder why she looks so happy," they asked. No one could imagine the beautiful things she had seen. How happily she had gone with her grandmother into the new year. Thank you for listening.